I'm George Crowley. I'm part of the ACE Emerging Professionals London and the South East Committee. Welcome to this ACE Emerging Professionals webinar organised by the London and South East Group. Today we're going to be exploring the issue of vertical extensions to buildings and whether they can solve the housing crisis, help us work towards our environmental targets and so on. So today we have joining us Tom Davies, a senior planner at Lichfields, and Charles Gillott, a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. At the end, we're going to have a little bit of time for some questions and answers, but we won't keep you too long this lunchtime, so don't worry. I'll explain how you can send your questions through on the next slide. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping to help this run smoothly. To ask your questions, please go to the chat function in the control panel. You can ask your questions throughout the seminar, and you can do so anonymously. So if you just pop them in the chat panel there. But don't worry, if you miss anything, we'll be uploading the webinar to our website in the next few days. If you want to listen again, you can. So I'm now going to hand over to Tom, who's going to give us a short overview of the planning for upwards extensions, including some planning policy around this and some key takeaways. So if you go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Georgia. Yeah, it's a real big pleasure to be involved in today's event. I'm Tom, I'm a senior planner at Lichfields, and I work specifically within Lichfields policy and law team. If we could go to the first slide, please. So I'm just going to move my video box. So today I will discuss the extension of buildings, specifically in the context of planning in England. I'll start by covering the national policy context, how building upwards is supported by the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, and how this area of policy can help achieve a number of other planning objectives. I'll then look at how opportunities to extend buildings form part of the government's wider agenda of planning reform, specifically the introduction of 5 new permitted development rights, which allow applicants to add additional stories to existing buildings. We'll briefly look at how these permitted development rights work in practice and look at some of the key requirements, the limitations and restrictions around using these, and also take a look at some of the key planning issues which need to be considered both for permitted development and also for general planning applications to support the delivery of new homes above existing buildings. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of national policy, incentivising building upwards at higher densities has been a key objective for some time. The Housing White Paper in 2017 trailed proposals for the new PD rights and also proposed a new paragraph and a new chapter within the NPPF, which promoted local plan policies to make more efficient use of space. There's obviously political reasons behind this, given that Greenbelt and the outward extension of towns and cities is an incredibly contentious area of planning. But there's also a lot of really good place-based benefits to supporting this. So I'm sure Charles will touch on some of these in more detail later, but building upwards and at high densities essentially allows for greater efficiency in land use. We have quite often higher density areas are more vibrant. You have greater volume of people to sustain better local services and amenities. It can also have really positive environmental and health benefits, such as reduced energy consumption for buildings. Sometimes more compact cities, walkable cities promote more sustainable forms of transport. You're less dependent on car use, and in general, there's the general health benefits which come with that. So the 2018 revisions, the NPPF, as I mentioned, resulted in a new chapter aimed at making effective use of land. This specifically called for authorities to make as much use as possible of previously developed or brownfield land. This doesn't just apply to new development on cleared sites. It introduced a new paragraph 118E, which called for local planning authorities to support opportunities to use the airspace above existing residential and commercial premises for new homes. In particular, they should allow upward extensions where the development would be consistent with the prevailing height and form of neighbouring properties and the overall street scene. So the policy essentially calls for a design-led approach where new development should respond to the existing characteristics and the opportunities presented by each site, whilst also calling for mitigation for any negative impacts on amenity, in particular daylight, sunlight, privacy, things like overlooking. So around the same time, the government in the housing white paper, around the same time as it introduced those revisions, the MPPF, the government also stated that it intended to introduce new permitted development rights, which would allow the extension of homes to be built in the airspace of existing buildings. So by way of background, for those who aren't so familiar with the planning system in the UK, permitted development rights are essentially a national grant of planning permission, which is granted in advance by the Secretary of State. These apply to quite tightly defined forms of development, but they also come with various limitations, restrictions, and conditions attached. And these are set out within the General Permitted Development Order 2015, but this is amended on quite a regular basis. It's only over the last, whilst this has been in existence, permitted development rights have existed since pretty much the start of the comprehensive statutory planning system, which was introduced in 1948. The permitted development, creating homes under permitted development rights, is a relatively new phenomenon in planning. It's only really been about the last 8 years where the government has allowed, to begin with, it was changes of use to convert offices to residential, as well as other buildings, including warehousing, storage, also takeaways. I think there is a PD right to allow for a change of use to residential. As I say, there's various conditions which do apply for many of these PD rights. It was last summer, though, that the government rolled out 5 new permitted development rights, which enable additional stories to be built above a range of different building typologies. So I'll just run through these briefly. There's a lot of overlap in how these work in terms of the conditions and the height you can go above, and in terms of the height of each story. The first one, though, which is slightly different from the rest, is in part 1 of the GPDO, and it's Class AA. This applies to existing homes, and it's just an enlargement. So it's similar to adding a back extension on your property. So you're not creating any new homes, but it allows, say, a bungalow to go up 1 story. I think a 1-story building can go up 1 story, 2 stories, it can go up 2 stories. Building lines need to be maintained, which in my opinion could lead to some quite oddly proportioned houses. Same materials need to be used again. In some ways it might stifle good design, but I think the principle of it is to kind of maintain the existing context and create as few issues as possible. Moving on, the remaining, I think it's 4. These allow for new stories to be added on purpose-built blocks of flats. If we can go to the next slide, we've got PD rights to allow additional stories on top of detached commercial buildings, commercial mixed-use buildings which form part of a terrace. So like a parade of shops or a typical kind of out-of-town high street might benefit from this. The next slide should cover the 2 which apply for new homes above existing residential properties. So on the left, that applies to buildings which are semi-detached or in a terrace, and on the right, relatively self-explanatory, just detached dwellings. So those are essentially the 5 new PD rights. We can go to the next slide, please. So as I've stated, there's various restrictions, limitations, and conditions which apply. As you might have noticed from the last few slides, the buildings were of a particular vintage. They must have been built between 1948 and the 5th of March 2018. So you're not going to be able to use PD rights for a typical Edwardian terrace or a Georgian building, particularly if that was in a conservation area of outstanding natural beauty, or if the building was listed. I think those dates roughly align with the kind of start of the modern planning system. I'm not sure of the actual specifics why it's so tightly drawn. One of the other kind of stricter measure limitations on this is they can't be within 3 kilometers of the perimeter of an aerodrome. It kind of seems self-evident. I thought 3 kilometers seems quite a wide area. You look at the map to the left of that slide, that shows there may well be more, but this shows a lot of the kind of aerodromes around the country. And there's a lot around the edges of quite big urban conurbations. The close-up map on the left shows the perimeter around City Airport in London, which actually takes off quite a big chunk of Newham, Tower Hamlets, Greenwich to the south, and Woolwich to the southeast of that. So it's worth considering if before you even start thinking about this, whether that might apply. In terms of the actual physical structure of the stories, under PD, the stories must be constructed above the principal part of the dwelling. So if you already have a back extension, it can't be above that. It needs to be above the original part of the building. It depends whether how high you can go up will depend on the height of the original building as well. I think there's a limit that each new story can be no taller than 3 meters. And as I mentioned before, for existing residential dwellings at least, you are required to use similar materials to that of the original build. Sorry, I think there's a builder next door. Hopefully that will stop shortly. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, there are potentially 10 prior approval matters which may need to be considered. So while no planning application is required for permitted development rights, applicants will need to apply for prior approval, which is considered against a closed list of matters which are on the right side of this slide. So that includes transport and highway impacts, air traffic, contamination, flood risk, importantly, the external appearance. So that allows local authorities to take into account design considerations, which some of the older PD rights for change of use to office weren't able to consider. So this might actually give local authorities a lot more scope to control the finished development, which they maybe didn't have before. And this is in response to some of the previous issues highlighted from a lot of the criticism around PD. Whilst these aren't considered against the development plan, these specific matters should be referred to against the National Planning Policy Framework. And the design guidance within that has been bulked up considerably recently. And it also does point applicants in the direction of the National Design Guidance. So I think there is opportunities for, as I said, for local authorities to take a much more hands-on approach to how they deal with prior approval matters, which might not be so popular with some developers, but on the other hand, might make them a more kind of politically acceptable form of development and will hopefully improve standards and kind of raise the bar in design quality going forward. If we go to the next slide, please. So I just touched upon that briefly, but there were a lot of criticisms over the past few years in terms of the design quality of certain schemes created predominantly under office to residential permitted development rights. So I mean, these are slightly different because this entailed a change of use from an existing building, which is obviously built for one purpose. So offices, warehouses, architects aren't necessarily thinking about people where they're going to sleep, access to adequate light and stuff like that. So there have been some major issues in the past of quite suboptimal accommodation being brought forward and local authorities not having the tools or the hard policies or legal tools there to restrict these. Some of the worst offenders brought forward schemes with much below the recommended internal space standards, schemes with no windows or windows looking onto atriums. There's also instances of new housing developments popping up in industrial parks and business parks, which probably aren't the most sustainable locations, not necessarily going to have great access to good quality local amenity space or shops and schools and the kind of local services which you expect to be located near to housing. So this is a big reason why they've had such a kind of negative press in the past. And in some cases for good reasons. So as a result of that, the government, after quite a lot of pushback from across the political spectrum and from a lot of professional bodies, including the REBA, RTPI, Town and Country Planning Association, the government finally announced last year that it would introduce the requirement for all new homes created under PD rights, and this will apply to new homes created for upward extensions. That from April this year, they will be required to meet the nationally described space standards, which are set out in the table to the right. So usually they're standards, so they're not in usual planning law, but a lot of local plans will, within their housing policies, would refer to these standards, and therefore developers would need to follow them. Whereas in the past, the prior approval process for an office to resi conversion made no reference to any space standards, which allowed studio flats of say 11 meters squared to be built, and no checks or balances on that. So if we can go to the next slide, another major difference between the homes created under PD, and this will apply to the upward extensions as well, and homes created via a regular application for planning permission, is that generally planning obligations related to the development can't be secured for homes created under PD. So these are obligations which might require a developer to provide affordable housing or a financial contribution in lieu of that. Also, it's more difficult to kind of require funding for local transport services, to fund GP practices or other local amenities. The planning practice guidance says by nature, permitted development should already be acceptable in planning terms. I think under the older planning, permitted development rights, that probably was the case, because these were quite limited in the impact they had. But the moment you start introducing new homes, you have a development, in my personal opinion, if you have a development of which brings 30 homes to an area, it's more difficult to say that that's acceptable in planning terms just on the principle. There's certainly going to be an impact on that. And I think this will continue to be an area which may change in the future. There's already been a lot of calls that homes created under PD should be providing affordable housing. On upward extensions, I guess it depends on the scale, because if you're only building 3 or 4 units above, they generally would fall under the threshold in a usual local plan. So quite often a smaller scheme wouldn't be required to provide affordable housing, generally on viability terms. But for a much larger development, it becomes a bit more questionable, and that I'm sure will be something which will continue to be debated over the coming years. Yeah, I'll just go on to I think it's my last slide now. So yeah, just concluding thoughts. So there's a lot of clear benefits to building upwards, and it's supported by national policy, and many local areas have specific policies for upward extensions in their local development plans. Permitted development rights provide a further incentive for developers and freeholders to take advantage of the headspace above their properties. It's likely that there will be some interest in this, but from past experiences showing that the streamlined approval process and the security and the certainty that the permitted development right grants, that will give some interest. But as I said, there's a lot of limitations, there's various restrictions, and actually at the end of it, it's not that much different. The amount of information you're required to submit to the planning authority isn't that much different from a regular planning application. I think a lot of planners will probably think that as a positive. It will allow local authorities to have more tighter control over this. Maybe be a bit of pushback from the developers, but actually a lot of developers have welcomed the introduction of standards because it creates a bit more of a level playing field and stops some of the worst offenders from undercutting them when bidding for sites. One issue I think is the way permitted development rights work is quite a blunt tool. So I think it might incentivize some suboptimal schemes. I talked earlier about the kind of design quality. If you're requiring, I don't think you should necessarily be required to use the same materials. There's a lot of quite poor housing around, which could actually be improved by doing something slightly different. Ensuring upward extensions have exactly the same roof on top, I think might just lead to houses looking quite poorly proportioned. As I say, though, it's not the only route, and actually the prior approval gaining permitted development for an upright extension could actually work as a useful fallback. So you have the principle is secured in law, and you can say it's okay to build upwards, and that permitted development right could fall as a bit of a kind of fallback position when submitting a regular planning application for a site, because essentially the principle of building upwards is firmly established there. Yeah, I think that's more or less everything for me. We've covered most of the new permitted development rights in some of our blogs. So if anyone's interested in reading more, I'd recommend signing up to our blog and get in contact, and I can send over some of the details in more specifically on this. So I'll pass over to Charles now.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really helpful insight on using permitted development to secure upward extensions, and a great condensation there of some pretty hefty policy. We've now got Charles, who's kindly agreed to present to us some of his ongoing and clearly very topical research on upward extensions from a sort of structural perspective, and giving us some information on stakeholders. So go on, Charles.
Cheers, Georgia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. Cheers to Tom and Georgia for the intro there. So a bit of background on myself and on my projects. I'm a civil and structural engineering graduate from the University of Sheffield, and I'm actually still at the university in the second year of my PhD within the RISE research group. We typically focus on improving resource efficiency within the built environment, but my project, as Georgia said, more specifically focuses on researching the potential for sustainable housing provision through the vertical extension of our existing buildings. So why is this important, and why is this something that I'm looking at in the first place? Well, in addition to the changes to permitted development rights that Tom outlined, I'm sure you're all aware that the UK is currently deep within a housing crisis. So to kick things off, I've got a question for you guys to get you involved. I think Chetna's going to put that up so you can give a response now. But the first question is, how many people are currently homeless in England? So I can see that most people went for 320,000 people there, but we had people across the entire spread. The actual value, and this is just for England alone, not the UK, is 280,000 people, and this comes from Shelter, the homelessness charity. So for those that chose a higher value, this might not seem like a lot of people, but to put into context, this is the same as filling the Olympic Stadium almost 5 times. So it's a huge amount of people that are now homeless. In terms of proportion of population, this is 1 in 200 people in England, but there's great variability across England. So in some areas, such as London, figures are as high as 1 in 52 people. And as you go even into smaller areas, such as Luton, you've got upwards of 1 in 30 people that are now homeless. If we delve a bit deeper into homelessness and look at homelessness by category, we can see that the majority of people are actually homeless living in temporary accommodation. So looking at the bottom 3 rows of the table there, we can see that more than 90% of the people classified as homeless in the UK are living in temporary accommodation, with the rough sleepers that we see day to day on the streets representing not even the tip of the iceberg of the problem, with just 5,000 people. The fact that most homeless people are living in temporary accommodation exemplifies the fact that the shortage of affordable housing has contributed towards this homelessness. Put simply, if we had the places to put these people, they wouldn't need to be living within the temporary accommodation that they are, and homelessness would be a far smaller problem than it currently is today. So, as well as homelessness, the housing crisis has also had the knock-on effects of increasing house prices over time. So the second question I've got for you guys is, what is the average cost of a first-time home in the UK? So I can see there, again, people choosing all different options, but most people opting for £160,000. So the actual figure is £200,000, and this comes from HM Land Registry, and it's people saying that this is their first home when purchasing it. I know we've got a few people joining from London today. You might think that that's a bit of a bargain. I can assure you it's not. When we're taking the country as a whole, and we also consider average salaries within the UK, and people looking to buy a house are also likely to be renting another property. The amount that they can save monthly means that purchasing a property at this value means they're simply priced out of the housing market. When we look at the types of houses that we're actually building in the UK, we can see that the new build houses that we're creating are actually more expensive on average than the existing houses that we have. So as the diagrams show, a new build house will cost you £300,000 on average in England, whereas an existing property will cost £230,000. Put simply again, the houses that we're building are actually decreasing the affordability of our housing stock. By looking at the annual percentage increase that's written on the two different types of properties there, we can also see that the rate at which the new build house costs are increasing is greater than that of our existing houses. So the gap is growing at an exponential rate, and more people are becoming priced out of home ownership. So if we know we've got a huge shortage of housing and that this is contributing to homelessness and increasing house prices, what is the scale of the problem and how many houses do we need to build to try and overcome this? Well, different values have been floated by a whole range of different organisations, both governmental and non-governmental. At the low end of the spectrum, you can see the 2015 government, who pledged to build 200,000 new homes a year, every year for 15 years. This was then bettered by the 2017 government, who promised that they'd build 300,000 new homes a year for 15 years. Between these two pledges, you've got requirement estimations by Town and Country Planning Association and KPMG and Shelter in a joint venture that are around 250,000 new homes a year. Then at the top end, we've got the UK Housing Review paper, which suggested 380,000 new homes must be built each year in order to account for the amassed deficit and growing population. So if that's what people seem to think that we need in terms of housing provision, how does this match up against what we have been building? Well, this is represented by the white dotted line you can see on the screen now. What this shows is that we're typically below the provision requirements, which many people actually think to be quite conservative in the first place. For example, the UK Housing Review suggests that we need 380,000 new homes, and you can quite simply see that we've been nowhere near this in any single year. This means that as well as the amassed deficit that we need to overcome, we're not even providing the amount of homes that we need to meet the growing population, again meaning the problem's getting worse and worse. As well as having a housing crisis, there are also a number of complications added to providing such large amounts of residential accommodation. And this is because we're plunged deep within a climate crisis. At the most fundamental level, we can look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This means that any future housing developments must promote good health and well-being, generate sustainable cities and communities, but that we must also build them in a way that consumes resources and generates waste in a responsible manner. Added to this, we have the fact that buildings are responsible for around 40% of global carbon emissions. This means that the built environment is one of the key battlegrounds of the climate crisis, and one area in which I think this is either going to be won or lost. This means that any future housing provision must be considerate of this and aim to reduce carbon emissions. Delving deeper into these carbon emissions and looking at how they are distributed across a whole building's lifespan, you can see that more than half of the emissions over a building's lifespan are emitted at the point up to its completion. So from the materials from which it's constructed and from the construction process itself. A further 20% are then emitted in terms of maintenance and refurbishment over the building's lifespan, with only 30% being attributable to the building's operation. So heating, ventilation, cooling, lighting, etc. Considering the ongoing decarbonisation of the electricity grid, it's also likely that this 30% will shrink in the future, increasing the relative portion that is represented by the embodied carbon of our buildings. I think this means it's this area in which we should be focusing on reducing carbon emissions going forward. At the other end of a building's lifespan, so when it's eventually demolished, we can see that it contributes a huge amount of waste to the UK's breakdown of waste. More than 62% of UK waste was generated from construction, demolition and excavation in 2019, which is far larger than even the next largest of 20%, which is associated with commercial industrial waste. These notions of reducing embodied carbon in materials and waste output materials from the built environment are key aspects of what we now call the circular economy. This differs from a linear economy in that when we extract materials, instead of just using these for a short while and then outputting them as waste, we instead share, adapt, reuse and recycle our existing infrastructure, looping materials back round so that they're maintained at their most useful state for as long as possible. Logically, this both reduces the amount of natural resources we have to extract and the amount of waste we send to landfill. Considering this, we know we need to generate a large amount of houses, and we know we need to do this in an environmentally benign way. The first question that we're posed with is, where are we going to put these? As touched on by Tom, this poses the age-old question of urban sprawl versus residential densification. As I'm sure most, if not all of you are aware, these sprawling approaches have a number of disadvantages, as suggested by Tom. The most obvious of which is consumption of green space. So as areas grow out, they consume the countryside. But we also have the fact that the housing typologies within these areas, so detached, semi-detached, brick-built houses, have high embodied carbon in comparison with some higher density urban structures. The low density and poorly connected nature of these settlements also means that they lock in reliance upon car travel, with people having to get into their car and drive to local amenities such as shops, leisure centres, parks, etc. Typically, though not always, a lot of these negatives are actually averted through urban densification. In exemplifying the benefits of residential densification, we can look at something called sublinear scaling. And what this means is, as the residential density of an area is increased, a certain metric increase at a rate beyond that. So in this example, you've got GDP per capita and income per capita. What this means is, if the residential density in an area was doubled, the GDP per capita of the area would more than double, as would the income per that area, income per capita within that area. Put shortly, we're typically more effective working within these high density centres. On the flip side, we have sublinear scaling. So the reverse, this means that if the population density of an area doubled, a certain metric would less than double. So if we increase density of an area, the length of road per capita required to support that conurbation decreases. More simply, we use less resources and less infrastructure when we live in these high density centres than if we live in suburban, low density alternatives. As well as the negatives of urban sprawl and the noted positives of residential densification, we can also see that providing houses within cities would be consistent with an ongoing trend. This has been going on since the 1800s and increasing till today, where we now have about 55% of people living with our cities. This is expected to increase to about 70% by 2050. So we need to think about how we're going to be meeting this demand. And that's the next question. If we know we need all this housing and we know we need to provide it within our city centres, what's the best way to do it? Well, for inspiration, we might look to the acts of the past. So here we can see 1950, we were happily housing 30% of the global population within our cities. Now, in order to increase that demand to 55% by 2018, we knocked down these existing structures and built a nice, shiny, new tower block capable of housing the amount of people that were required to be. So in the future, why not do the same? Knock down our once new, shiny tower block and build an even newer, even shinier, even taller tower block capable of housing 70% of the population. When we think about the circular economy and the climate crisis, however, we can see that this has a number of negative implications, namely in waste generation from the demolished building and in resource consumption from building the new building. The alternative to this would be to adapt our one shiny new building, potentially vertically extending this and adding new stories to meet the 70% requirement by 2050. Again, considering the circular economy, we can see that the resource consumption is likely to be far lower in this instance, with the waste generation effectively being nil if the project is carried out effectively. Here, you've got a comparison of the two options. So fantastic. Assuming you solve vertical extension, it's the best idea. It's going to solve all the problems. The next question that we need to address is, well, if it's this great, will it work? We heard from Tom about changes to permitted development rights, which now mean that on many different types of buildings, we're now allowed to extend. This, however, doesn't necessarily mean that we can extend. And potentially, if we start adding stories to these buildings, will they all fall down and we'll be left with a pile of rubble? In looking at addressing this, we go to existing literature. And we can see that there's a significant amount of evidence for over-design in existing buildings. For example, this one study that looked at the utilization of structural steel in buildings found that the utilization ratio of the columns and beams within that building were about 0.5 and 0.4 respectively. And what this means is only 40% or 50% of the effective resistance offered by the members within that building are being used. A more recent publication goes one step further than this and claims that a third of the steel in the frames that were analysed in this case study could have been saved. So this is a third of the material that's been put there in the past that is now effectively wasted and sitting there redundant. In order to look at how we can maybe utilise this reserve capacity, this is where the research that we're undertaking at the University of Sheffield plugs in. Here you can see a very simplistic outline of the research that we are currently and will be undertaking in the future, and it's split down loosely into 3 work packages. We've got the first work package, which is the structural side of things, seeing whether our existing buildings can take these extensions. We've then got work package 2, which looks more at stakeholder perceptions, and even if we can extend these buildings and are allowed to by permitted development rights, do people want to live in these type of settlements, and do companies want to design and build vertical extension schemes? This also aims to uncover barriers to vertical extension and also potential enablers, so ways of overcoming this going forward. The finding of these 2 bits of work will then be combined along with other aspects such as GIS data sets and the planning rights outlined by Tom in a city scale assessment that will begin to look at the potential vertical extension when carried out at a large scale, so either city or regional level. Looking at work package 1, the structural side of things, the first step we took was to kind of do an initial case study feasibility assessment. This was very rudimentary in nature, relied upon traditional hand calculations, which are known not to be that accurate in the modern age. And we only looked at 1 building. By effectively reverse engineering this building and seeing the load by which, the amount by which the load on the columns could be extended, we're able to identify a reserve capacity of 22 kilonewtons per metre squared. So in real terms, this means that that building, the single case that we analysed, was capable of being extended by around 1.8 stories if we used a steel frame. But if we opted for a lightweight alternative, such as cross-laminated timber, we could extend this by upwards of 3 stories. So having done an initial feasibility assessment, our next attempt was to try and get more generalisable and widely applicable results. The first issue that we ran into here was the availability of data. So we quite simply couldn't get companies, designers, architects, engineers to part with their designs such that we could analyse these. Because of this, we had to work on conceptual frames, so taking standard section sizes, standard structural grids and story heights, and kind of designing conceptual buildings ourselves and then analysing them. This obviously meant that we couldn't identify actual reserve capacity in real-world case study buildings, but instead had to look at inefficiencies in codes of practice and how these might contribute to reserve capacity. We chose to look at the effect of column continuity, so where a column extends from your first, your second, and your third story. It's quite often modelled as just extending over 1. But the fact it extends means it's actually slightly stiffer in reality than it's currently modelled as. By taking account for this and using our conceptual frames, we're able to identify a fairly consistent average reserve capacity contribution of 1.5 kilonewtons per metre squared. For the engineers who are listening, you'll be shaking your head saying, okay, that's not enough to vertically extend. Correct, but it offers quite a significant contribution, and also a contribution which is likely to be present in a lot of steel-framed buildings that are designed using this assumption. When you combine this with other sources of reserve capacity, such as rationalization, and the fact that we only have a limited number of section sizes, you can start to see that there is actually a significant likelihood of being able to extend our existing steel frame buildings. On the structural side still, we want to build upon our two previous assessments and kind of combine these. This will be in the development of an assessment framework for identifying the reserve capacity of steel frame buildings. Similar to the first one, it will work in a very similar way. However, we'll use finite element analysis, where before we use hand calculations, so increasing the accuracy, and so hopefully the portion of reserve capacity we're able to identify. It will also use parametric modeling rather than a more simplified spreadsheet approach, so that we can very effectively increase the column end loads to the point at which we identify these failing. As with the first study, the main issue we're having here is data collection. So we've got just less than 15 buildings so far, and we're expecting at least 30 more, but obviously many more than this would be preferable. Because this is something we're struggling on, there's a QR code there. If anyone in the audience feels that they would be able to contribute to this work and help us in identifying the potential for vertical extension, feel free to scan that or email me. I'll put a link in at the end, and you can see how you might be able to contribute to our research. So moving over to work package 2. This looks at the stakeholder perception side of things. The first aspect of this was a stakeholder survey. This was published sometime last year, finished in January, and we managed to receive 84 respondents to this, and these were from a good spread of different stakeholder groups. So clients, architects, engineers, contractors, planners, etc. Each respondent was asked about their involvement in vertical extension projects at different design stages. So this allowed us to uncover whether vertical extension was commonly considered at the conceptual design stage, but never carried through to construction, or whether people simply don't consider vertical extension at all, and it's never on the table. We also asked people what their reasons for consideration or non-consideration were, so that we can begin to uncover barriers to vertical extension. We also asked people who had taken part in a vertical extension project what their experience of this was, and also asked if they had a future desire going forward to work on such projects. It then moved on to quiz each stakeholder on a series of potential barriers and enablers to vertical extension, with these being split up using the categories you can see on the screen. Though we've not had the data out from this for a long time, and we're just in the initial stages of analysing this, I can't show you much of it, but this is an example of the kind of thing that we've been able to pull from the survey. So when asked whether they thought government policy and legislation or the nature of the construction sector was a barrier or enabler to vertical extension, you can see that more people perceived the nature of the construction sector to be a barrier than they did government policy and legislation. You can also see that most people saw policy and legislation as having no impact on vertical extension at all. Coming out of the surveys, and based upon the results that we found, we're now in the process of drafting a series of stakeholder interviews in order to uncover more nuance on some of the findings that we're able to get from the survey. There's going to be roughly 10 of these, and they'll be semi-structured, and again, they will be conducted against key stakeholder groups to make sure that we get a decent transect of the construction sector. The interviews will be focused on gaining insights on the barriers and enablers, just as with the survey. But we'll also go further than this, looking at drivers for vertical extension, potential knock-on benefits of vertical extension, which aren't directly drivers in the current situation. And we also want to uncover more nuance on stakeholder roles based upon some findings that we've got from the survey. Moving on to the final section of our work. This is work package 3. It's a bit further down the line, so things are more conceptual at this point. We've not got definite answers of what it is we're going to be doing. But this is a city scale analysis. Basically, this will be taking the single building level vertical extendability from work package 1, combining it with some of the restrictive factors identified in work package 2 to look at the potential of vertically extending an area or whole city. We'll then look at limitations of doing this and also any potential impacts. So looking at some of the planning pre-application criteria that were outlined by Tom. There's also potential here to undertake some comparative assessments. So we look at providing housing within vertical extension developments and how this might be more beneficial or have downsides on providing the same amount of housing in, for example, a new housing estate. So thank you all for listening. I hope you've all learned something there. I think we're going to hand back over to Georgia now for any questions that you might have got. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. That was really interesting. I'm excited to hear where your research continues to progress. We've had a few questions in the chat. I'll ask you a couple. We've not got loads of time left, but so the first one I'll direct towards Tom. What do you think about, could the vertical extensions help with the revitalisation of town centres?
I think it's a good question. PD rights alone, I think, might have limited effect. As I said, there's limitations to using them in areas, conservation areas. There's a lot of conservation areas across our high streets and town centres, a lot of listed buildings as well. So there's obviously those constraints there. But more generally, I think building more housing in our high streets and town centres is going to be key to kind of regenerating these going forward. And there's definitely a lot of room for building at higher densities and upwards. And yeah, I'm sure we'll see a lot more of it. It's just, but if not through the PD route, I'm sure through regular planning application route instead.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you just said right there from a planning perspective, especially. Charles, we've got one that says, was there consideration for impact on stability systems design for increased structure height? I think that's something that you considered exploring.
Put simply, no. At this stage, we're very much looking at column capacity under the assumption that this is likely to be one of the most limiting factors. In the future, obviously, these rather rudimentary assessment, different aspects and obviously other failure modes. But at the first instance, it's to be used as a feasibility tool at the initial design stage. For example, okay, let's get a ballpark figure. Can we add 5 stories? Can we add 3 stories? And these other nuances will be ironed out towards the end. So
there's lots of places, lots of avenues to explore following this research, essentially. I wanted to ask at the end, you mentioned the city scale analysis. You mentioned that you'd assess the potential offered by vertical extension at the city scale. Can you give us a bit more detail on how those comparative assessments might work?
Yeah, so like I say, it's a long way down the line at the moment. There's certain things still to be determined on that. But we're hoping that from the single building level extendability that we've got, so we might find an average, or that these vary based upon typology. We'll then combine this with GIS, so we can, if we have an extendability for steel frame buildings from a certain period, we can apply this to each building within the assessment area and say, okay, using different filters, if we extend this to the maximum allowed by current planning regulations, or if we extend this to what we think might be introduced in the future, we can begin to see the floor space that we'll be able to generate within our cities. We can then divide this up using the amount of floor space that we know to be required for a single house, to then get the number of residential units. This then allows us to compare, say, 20 vertically extended houses with 20 houses providing a housing estate, and we can look at embodied carbon, operational carbon, connectivity, productivity, all these things.
Really interesting. Potentially a final question, unless we have any more sent to the chat in the next minute or so. One that you could both give a perspective on, possibly. Would you encourage policy for new builds to be designed with expansion in mind? So maybe from a planning perspective, or from a structural. Either of you want to have a go first?
Yeah,
Tom?
I think so, and I think, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to see how there's a lot of considerations, but I think it's always something to bear in mind. I know in London, and this touches on some of the points that Charles was talking about earlier, there's a new circular economy route which looks at the kind of future proofing of buildings, not only in terms of materials used, but how they might be used going forward. So I think there's potential to think about that. It's all about thinking about the limitations really, and a lot, I mean, the government's got a real fixation on design at the moment, and most of that relates to the impact on the existing context. But I think we're not thinking enough about the future context of areas and thinking about how areas can change positively. And that includes like future proofing areas and potentially allowing places to build up. But I'm sure we'll see it more in the future. And I think, but it may be something for architects to think about as much as planners. But I definitely support the idea of that, the notion of it.
It's interesting, Tom, you mentioned there the circular economy statement, things that are coming in London. With whether you should be designing new builds with future extendability or redundancy for adaptation in mind, is kind of a question you need to be thinking about the building lifespan, whether it's even likely that this building will see a requirement for a change of use in the future. There's no point putting in this reserve capacity if the building is to be taken down. It's only a temporary structure. Instead, you should be designing for maybe deconstructibility. So these key circular economy principles, if you like, you should be targeting one, which may be to design for future adaptability. But it's not necessarily a requirement to be consciously adding in this reserve capacity. It's likely that because of the way the design codes are, you're inherently adding reserve capacity without trying to do that.
Yeah, really interesting. We've just had another query as well, if we can't think of any off the top of our heads, and I'm sure these could be provided, but do we know of any examples of successful upward extension developments? Have you explored sort of any in your research so far, Charles, or is this
no case studies of successful developments? I don't have any on the top of my head. And I know there's some buried in a literature review that I've done somewhere. So if you want me to send them over after this, I can. I don't know if you've got anything on that, Tom.
I can't think of particular instances off the top of my head, but I know in Paris it's been a big policy area for a long time in terms of there's a much more uniform skyline. Westminster Council, though, they've got specific guidance on building. It's similar context, I guess, to Paris. Lots of 5-6-story Georgian, Victorian, predominantly terrace streets. So it's quite uniform, but there's actually I think they've got decent guidance in place. They've got very strict conservation rules there, and actually that's resulted in pretty decent quality stuff. None of that, maybe actually now, but actually no, Westminster is pretty much entirely a conservation area, so I think it'll be exempt from the new PD rights. There's a lot of examples which have been, I think, of good, probably I think a good place to start for that is looking at historic buildings where there's been just this really strict policy legal requirement to keep intact as much of the physical fabric of a building, whereas I think a lot of developers quite often rather start afresh in some instances. But I think those are probably where you're going to see some of the better quality upward extensions. But I'm sure there's lots of other examples too. I can't think of any specific off the top of my head though, so I have to be put on the spot.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up then. But if anyone did want to continue the discussion and ask any more questions, then do connect with ACE Emerging Professionals and myself, Charles and Tom on LinkedIn to continue the conversation. Thanks so much for listening again. We hope you find this really interesting, and we've got some upcoming webinars from ACE Emerging Professionals that are on your screen right now. If you want to check out the website or the social media, you can find the details of those. Just a reminder that we've recorded this webinar, and we'll send you all a link later so that you can refer back to it and forward it on to any colleagues you think might be of interest. And we'll see you next time. Thanks very much, guys.
Right, thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.